So Justin and I have made a bunch of videos talking through many different players, but we wanted to narrow down all of our least favorite players into one video. So here's a look at 6 players that Justin and I are avoiding in every single league that we think that you should too. Roll the tape. So we'll start off with the first sleeper who is just not worth the hype this year that you should not draft, and that's Austin Ekeler, now acting as the RB2 or RB1B for the Washington Commanders. The reason why you shouldn't draft him is because he just wasn't that good last year, and I don't expect him to be any better this year on a new team. In 14 games played last year, Ekeler averaged 85 yards and 0.5 touchdowns per game on 16 total touches per game. That is a 17-game pace of over 1,300 total yards, 7 total touchdowns on 280 touches. That is horribly inefficient, averaging 3.5 yards per carry, 8.5 yards per reception, and because of that, he only averaged 13 fantasy points per game as the RB21 overall. What really saved his fantasy performances were touchdowns and massive target numbers. In fact, out of 14 games played, he either scored over 20 PPR points thanks to either scoring twice or seeing 7+ targets in those games, or he scored under 12 PPR points. There was no in between for Austin Ekeler last year, and that is while playing 65 to 75% of snaps in a fairly mediocre offense. So now in Washington, he is not the best running back on the team. Brian Robinson is, so I expect Ekeler to take a backseat in snaps and touches, and I don't expect him to be averaging 5.5 targets per game like he did last year because of playing fewer snaps, and also Jaden Daniels is a mobile quarterback who can scramble rather than check it down. Not to mention that Brian Robinson is also just a very capable receiver himself, so Ekeler might just be playing the Antonio Gibson role as a receiving-only handcuff running back who, if you're lucky, might get you like 8 to 10 fantasy points some weeks. That's just not a player that I want on my team because I might get tricked into playing him more than I actually should, and he could wind up losing me weeks because of it. From ESPN and Yahoo ADP, he's around the RB35-ish overall, but there are way better running backs with way more upside going around him with guys like Javonte Williams, Tony Pollard, and Tyjae Spears, Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, Jerome Ford, Gus Edwards, and Blake Corum. I just do not want Austin Ekeler on any of my rosters and do not want to draft him in August right now when I might just be dropping him for a better running back by week 4. Now, before we move on, I wanted to let y'all know to head over to 4for4.com and sign up for a subscription today to gain access to the industry's best fantasy rankings from award-winning ranker for accuracy John Paulson. Plus, you get access to our live draft assistant, cheat sheets, trade calculator, articles, and there are additional packages for DFS and betting content too. Make sure to use the code YouTube at checkout to receive 25% off your annual subscription today. And this hurts me a lot to say because I really like Chris Olave, but I just don't see him living up to his wide receiver 10 to 12 ADP as a second round pick in drafts this year on both ESPN and Yahoo platforms. That just doesn't make sense to me. I could honestly end this argument right here and say that Chris Olave has never finished above wide receiver 20 in PPR formats on a points per game basis. That's just the truth. And this team is almost a carbon copy of itself from last year. Nothing's changed. It's still Derek Carr at quarterback. No other real target competition for massive targets. So Olave is still easily going to be the team's wide receiver 1 for a first-time play caller in Clint Kubiak. And if you look at Olave's numbers from last year, there was a lot to really like. He was 12th in total targets at 8.5 per game. He was 4th in deep targets, 6th in total air yards, and he averaged over 25% target share and target rate. Both good for top 20 in the league. All absolutely amazing numbers that you would love for any wide receiver, especially for a young and up-and-coming talent like Chris Olave. The issue, though, is touchdowns. He only scored 5 last year, 4 in 2022 as a rookie, and that comes mainly from a lack of red zone targets, which he was 33rd in the league in last year. So if he's not able to convert these big plays into touchdowns and he's not getting many red zone targets, touchdowns just aren't going to really fall for him. And that's a huge difference between a wide receiver finishing as a top 20 guy versus a top 10 guy. Even his expected fantasy points per game last year, which were 3 points per game higher than his actual points per game, still only puts him at wide receiver 17 in 2023. So with an ADP around wide receiver 10, you are expecting him to have his breakout season when nothing has realistically changed from last year to this year. He's being drafted ahead of guys like Nico Collins, Brandon Ayuk, Jalen Waddle, DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, Michael Pittman, Cooper Kupp even. All guys who have done it before, and most have done it for multiple years, and you can get all of them in the third or even fourth rounds of your drafts, not the second round. Even Drake London is going around later in ESPN drafts, and I'd argue that London has a higher probability of having his breakout this year, considering the massive quarterback upgrade that he got. It just doesn't make sense to draft a guy like Olave as a cornerstone player on your team, but with so little upside to actually make a difference over guys that you can get later. And then finally, we have to talk about my bust candidate for 2024, a player that I believe is honestly the worst pick in the entire top 100 of ADP this year. Raiders running back Zamir White. Please, I beg you, do not fall into the trap of drafting Zamir White this year because, guys, we play this game every year and it never works. There's always that one running back who gets massively pushed up draft boards because of super small sample sizes and potentially massive volume, but everybody overlooks the fact that that player is usually just not that good. Alexander Mattison is the easy example because it's fresh in our minds from last year. He did really well in games that Dalvin Cook missed, but he's actually just not that good of a running back, and even though he got volume last year, he was not good for fantasy football. In 2022, it ended up being Chase Edmonds, who signed with the Dolphins as their potential RB1 after posting very strong weeks with the Cardinals, filling in for an injured James Conner. Well, Chase Edmonds didn't rush for over 35 yards once and was traded to Denver by week 9 and was a complete fantasy football bust. In 2021, it was Mike Davis, who signed with the Atlanta Falcons after a huge season in Carolina, filling in for Christian McCaffrey, and was the presumed RB1 in a brand new Arthur Smith offense. And unfortunately, Davis just was not good for fantasy. He never topped 55 yards in a game once and was once again another fantasy bust. In 2020, it was Kenyon Drake who tripped everyone into a top 12 fantasy ADP, really just because of 3 games with the Cardinals post David Johnson, but ultimately finished outside the top 25 in points per game behind Ronald Jones and Clyde Edwards-Helaire that year. In 2019, it was Damian Williams. In 2018, it was Alex Collins. 2017, Isaiah Crowell. 2016, Jeremy Langford. 2015, Andre Ellington. The list goes on, and who is the glaringly obvious candidate for the 2024 season but Zamir Alexa White? This is a brand new coaching staff, brand new offensive system than what the Raiders had last year. This is not the same offensive coordinator that was calling plays when White did well for 4 games without Josh Jacobs last year. He is not a receiving threat. That is Amir Abdullah's role. And no one has seemed to mention the fact that 3 of the 4 defenses he faced last year were bottom 10 in fantasy points allowed to running backs. 2 of them were actually bottom 5. He did tear up the Kansas City Chiefs. I will give him credit there, but that was also a cold, divisional, outdoor December game where the Raiders actually scored twice on defense and were up by 2+ scores for more than half the game. So White was really just running down the clock and got massive volume because the Raiders were trying to win the game. But when you look at what he did last year in those 4 games, he averaged just 15 fantasy points per game on 23 touches per game over that 4-game stretch. That is horribly inefficient from a point per touch standpoint. I seriously would not be surprised if he was not the starter by the end of the year, kind of like this year's version of Dameon Pierce, who lost his job halfway through last year to Devin Singletary. I just don't get why he's being valued as a mid to back end RB2 in ADP, and there are so many other running backs around him that I would much rather have. Guys like Ramondre Stevenson is going around him, David Montgomery, Tony Pollard, Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, James Conner, Brian Robinson even. Please do not draft Zamir White this year in your leagues.
2nd and 11. Lawrence looking deep in the end zone. Engram holds on. Touchdown. What a catch. Evan Engram with his 2nd touchdown of the day.
It's difficult to outright fade any of the tight ends going in the top 10, but Engram is the best candidate. He had a monster 2nd season in Jacksonville, but continued to be very inefficient. Among 46 qualifiers, he ranked 41st in yards per catch and 22nd in yards after catch. Calvin Ridley is out of town, but Christian Kirk is not. Kirk operates in similar areas of the field as the tight end, but has historically done much more with his opportunities. In 12 2023 games, Kirk earned 9.3 yards per target to Ingram's 6.7, had a 61.4% first down rate to Ingram's 42.1, and earned 0.20 EPA per target to the tight end's 0.04. It would behoove the team to forget about getting Engram 143 targets again when there are far more efficient and explosive options in the new-look offense. Because of his lack of playmaking abilities, if he were to fall closer to the middle of the pack in target share, his fantasy outlook would dwindle. Options like David Montgomery, Terry McLaurin, James Conner, or Christian Kirk himself are going in the same range as Engram and make for much better selections.
Jackson looking to dial it up. Jackson has time. Jackson gets out of the pocket. He's going to throw on the move. Rainbow caught. Zay Flowers.
Around. Flings it to Flowers. Touchdown. Deep drop. Time to throw. Lets it rip. He's got Flowers. Touchdown.
As a rookie, the Ravens schemed Flowers' touches from the outset. In 2 of his first 3 NFL games, he hit 10 targets, but failed to earn an ADOT of above 3.5 in those contests. While they would expand his role throughout the season, he still only clocked in as fantasy's wide receiver 32, scoring 10.5 half PPR points per game. There's a chance his route tree continues to bloom, but we should have a full healthy season out of Mark Andrews, while the team also added Devontae Walker in the draft and Derrick Henry through free agency. Even if Walker and Henry don't take touches away from the sophomore wide receiver, a healthy Andrews sure will. According to 4for4's market share splits app, the splits with and without the tight end on the field were stark. In 9 games in which Andrews logged more than 5 snaps, Flowers averaged 6.4 targets and 8.2 half PPR points per game. With Andrews off the field, the wide receiver averaged 7.1 targets and 13.5 half PPR points per game. Flowers scored over 10 fantasy points in 6 games during his rookie season, and 5 of them came with Andrews off the field. There's no doubt that Flowers will log some spike weeks with his yards after catch ability, but it's going to be a pain to peg those weeks if he is operating as your team's wide receiver 2. He is currently coming off draft boards as the wide receiver 26, which makes him a stay away unless his draft cost drops.
For the quarterback, deep drop. Here comes the blitz. He flings it over the middle. Yards after the catch. The Colts have it with Josh Downs inside the 40. He sprints up to the 30-yard line. Another big play for Josh Downs down to the Tennessee 30-yard line. Gain of 25.
Early reports from training camp were no less than glowing for the second-year former third-round selection, Josh Downs. In a late July article from Colts beat writer James Boyd, he quotes OC Jim Bob Cooter as saying, quote, "Josh is going to get his catches, going to get his targets, and he's going to earn some different sort of spots, some different sort of roles as he goes into developing." It was encouraging to hear as the slot receiver is coming off a good rookie season in which he hauled in 68 catches for 771 yards from his 94 targets, most of which, of course, came from Gardner Minshew. Downs was locked into 3 wide receiver sets, with Alec Pierce always lining up out wide and Michael Pittman Jr. moving around the formation. That role as a nearly every snap player was put into question when the Colts decided to once again address the wide receiver room through the NFL draft, selecting Adonai Mitchell with their 52nd overall pick. Mitchell developed into a vertical threat in his 1 year with Texas, using his great combination of size and speed to cause defenders headaches with teammates Xavier Worthy and tight end Jatavian Sanders. While Worthy and Sanders were the beneficiaries of underneath and RPO targets, most of Mitchell's damage came in the form of 9 routes and end breakers deep down the field. With that lack of layup targets, we can start to get an idea of why his statistical profile wasn't in the top echelon of this draft class. His profile as an X receiver seemed to complement Downs more than simply replacing him. With the positive buzz around Downs during training camp, that didn't seem like a possibility, but with most reports having Mitchell sitting behind Alec Pierce in the pecking order. Downs would have missed time with the team start to move Pittman into the slot more than his usual 25% rate. We might find out in the early portions of the regular season, as Downs suffered a high ankle sprain that should keep him out of action for 4 to 6 weeks or right up until opening weekend kickoff.